Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 183rd Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our televised discussions twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded political dialogue. During our last discussion, we took on the topic of the surge in crime in the United States. What are its possible causes, and what can be done about it? Today, our panel consists of Joe Gaines, former member of the faculty of the University of Akron, Patty Haskins, member of the Wadsworth City Council, and Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. Joe, our current surge in violent crime is running parallel with an increase in racial unrest. To what extent do you think one has to do with the other?
Well, I think it's an interesting question because I don't agree with it.
You don't agree with what?
That they're parallel, but I don't think one is causing the other. I don't think racial unrest is being caused by violent crime. I think racial unrest is there anyhow. If the crime rate was down, I think we'd still have racial unrest in some manner.
So you don't think one has anything to do with the other?
Well, not as much as it seems like we have it written here. I don't think it's an extreme. My feeling is that in many cases, violent crime is on the increase, and there's no question about that. You can't get hold of a newspaper or watch TV, watch the news without seeing an increase in crime. Shootings all the time. Has it anything to do with race? I don't know.
Do you acknowledge that we have an increase in racial unrest ever since the Floyd killing?
No.
You
I'll
don't
tell you
think
why. I'm saying no. Not that we don't, as much as we always have, but it came out because of the shooting, because of the killing. We're much more aware of it now, but it's always been there.
at this level?
I think so. I look at things from the white point of view, and that's not always the right way to do it. That's the only way I can do it. If I were an African American, I might see it completely different. I have friends who are very, how can I say, educated, wealthy, uh, mobile, and they're afraid. They're African Americans, but they're afraid of the situation of what they have to teach their children, how they teach their children, um, things that are going on. When I say afraid, meaning they're really aware of it much more than I.
I'm confused. What is it that they're aware of?
Well, they're aware of police pulling their kids over for what seems to be no reason at all. Attitude from us, attitude from police, attitude from everybody that's white.
Attitude. How do I hear that, but I guess I just don't see it or see any real definite examples of it anywhere.
Is that because we're white? We don't see it?
Possibly, yeah. But I don't hear blacks talking about it specifically. They talk about it in generalizations. They want to talk an awful lot about the history of racism and slavery and Tulsa and a lot of things. But as far as our current environment, I haven't seen. Maybe it's because I watch the wrong television news. I'm not at all sure. Patty, what do you think?
Well, I disagree a little bit with what Joe said in that I do think that there is more racial unrest going on right now. If you consider everything that happened last summer and the protests, unfortunately, those protests devolved into looting and riots. My question in a lot of cases there, though, is whether the looting and rioting was caused by those that were actually protesting or just opportunists who felt, gee, now's a great time to go and rob this store. The concern that I have, though, is that I'm asked that this has increased crime. Whether it's correlation or causation is up for question or debate. For example, in the past year, there's been an extremely large increase in the purchasing of guns and ammunition across the country. Now, could we then attribute that to the increase in crime because more people own guns? I don't know. I have, thoughts on that. But again, is it correlation or is it causation? Is the rise in the purchase of guns causing the increase in crime? As we discussed last week, I think there's a lot of causes for the increase in crime, and we have to look at all of them, and we can't pin it down to just, one thing. You had mentioned in your notes that, while there's a racial component to this, perhaps, I think more so what I see is a political component to the rise in crime. Presently, the rise in crime has been the talking point, along with immigration, for the Republicans and the conservatives. And they're making that a strong issue for the upcoming 2022 elections and the 2024 elections. And so they politicize this. Now, it's interesting. They talk about defunding and everything else that's happened in the country, and we need to respect police. But I think the indication that this is nothing more than a political comment would be the reactions possibly to the January 6th hearings that we just saw this week. We had 4 officers, Capitol Police and Washington, D.C. Police, that testified before the House committee, after which I was watching Fox News in the evening, and conservative pundits, Laura Ingraham and also Tucker Carlson, made fun of these officers. They were making too big a deal about it. So while we pray, they want to praise officers and say that they are being, abused and so forth when it comes to Black Lives Matter or the protests that occurred last summer, when it doesn't fit their political niche, as in the case of the January 6th situation, then these officers are not to be believed, and they're acting and they're just crying for no reason, and they should, grow up and not act like babies. Obvious hypocrisy. Now, is the hypocrisy only on the right? No, it's on the left as well, because you cannot, as a Democrat, as a liberal, you can't say that nothing happened last summer and that all of those protests were peaceful and there was no disruption within the country. And there was the disrespect towards law officers did not exist. And then turn around and make a big deal about January 6th. We have to be consistent upon these issues. Yeah. I think there are problems within the police force. I think, this is one of the things I mentioned last week as well, that President Biden is trying to attack the crime issue on a multi-pronged approach. And that, yes, the police do need to have reform. There do need to be some changes. Is that done by defunding police? No. And, all police departments right now are struggling with numbers, and it doesn't have anything to do with defunding. I've been on the safety committee many years in Wadsworth. I've been on council for 10 years, and I was chair of the safety committee for 2 years. And one of the problems we've had is hiring new officers. I think we're right at a point now where we've actually hired all of the officers that we have budgeted for, and we've actually increased that number over the years. But we have a heck of a time finding qualified people to fill those positions. And this was before all of the uproar last summer. This is not just a new problem, that there are many that are, it's very difficult to find qualified, good candidates who want to fill those positions. So if you have that problem, even in a city like Wadsworth, where I think we have an excellent police force who are well respected,
Are
you're
they
going
paid,
to also have that problem
are they
in
paid,
other cities.
are they paid competitively?
I'm sorry, what?
Are they paid competitively with other
Yes.
communities? Are they?
Yes,
think
I
it-
think so. There is a difference. I think, depending, I'm sure that you probably would make more in a large city where the crime rate is higher, but of course there's a greater risk to that. But I think, yes, they are paid competitively, and we try to make sure that they are. There are a lot of advantages to working for the city, for any type of government job that you do not have out in the private sector. So, yes, but we've always had that problem. So it's not surprising to me that large cities, which have a great deal of difficulty, are having trouble.
It has
That's
to be
just kind of where
it has to be a pretty easy tour of duty for a Wadsworth policeman. I remember talking to a former chief who'd been on the force for over 30 years. He had only drawn his weapon once in 30 years and never fired it. That has to be a pretty soft duty for a cop to never be.
I don't know if it's as I would call it a soft duty, because they still have problems. I mean, the number one, I think the scariest thing and the most risky is dealing with domestic squabbles. Those are the issues where you walk into a home and there's a fight and there's a gun involved, and you are taking your life in your hands. I think it's something to be said for our community that police officers have not had to fire weapons that
Plus,
often.
in many cases, a police officer in Wadsworth knows the people, which can cause more
Yes.
problems than helps.
Yeah, I suppose.
And once again, Patty, you made my ideas much clearer. Thank you.
Ron, do you see any causation between race and the crime rate?
Well, in a secondary level, I think it's pretty clear from people who study this that poverty is a main issue here. And in this country, this equates more or less to Black and Latino communities. These are where the highest poverty rates are. And so there is all the disenfranchisement and the problems that arise from that. But I'm ready for a good rant here. I think people who study this situation really point out, and I can't see how any sane person can disagree, that the number of guns you have in the community is going to lead to a number of increasing uses of those guns. The city of Summit County is averaging this year about almost 7 days between a violent homicide or a murder. This has come on. The state legislature, and is time for my rant here, is not really taking significant steps here. And Dayton was it 2 years ago now that the governor proposed a number of issues, and what did the state legislature do? Well, pretty much nothing. They ignored any opportunity to study any sort of red flag law that may or may not help, but they ignored it. They have emasculated some extent home rule, so that individual communities are unable to set up their individual gun control opportunities or endeavors. And they put up a nice license to kill, stand your ground law, which is sort of against the advice of most people in the law enforcement industry. So this goes on. Certainly, I think that what I recall reading from my statistics last week is that the gun purchases were spiking even before the pandemic hit. There was no direct correlation between the number of homicides, and we're talking in crime rate, we're talking homicides here, recall, violent crime, not overall crime, violent crime, between the number of Black Lives Matter protests and the number of homicides in most major cities. All cities have seen some of this, but so there's no direct correlation with the racial unrest. I agree with Joe that racial unrest is with us and has been with us and will continue to be with us. Joe, you're talking about, and John addressing the idea of Black parents being very apprehensive and having to counsel their children about how to behave among in a white community, among law enforcement. And I have read so many accounts of that from individuals who have said that, so that the racial unrest is a real thing, and systemic racism is a real thing. We have talked about that. And all these things bear into, I think this. Now, I saw in the Akron Beacon Journal just yesterday that Akron City Council took on a large study where they didn't really talk about, oh, here are the problems, but tried to propose, I think, 40 or 50 possible solutions of what this might be. People chiming in with all their ideas, both the council and the community leaders involved in this. And they have set, for September's meeting, one of the councilmen has a couple of interns, and they're going to try to research over the country which of these ideas, whether they be red flag or laws or whatever have been effective and what the effectives might be, and try to bring solutions to this. And a great deal of it turns out from people who study this is that you need community involvement. You need to have people, police officers, community leaders, programs within communities, both poor communities and other communities that will try to foster conflict resolution, will try to foster respect for police, respect for authority. This is lacking by and large through our white and Black communities, and
Good point.
it's a severe problem, and you have to approach. I think Patty's mentioned, you have to approach this on many levels, with many points of view, and try to reach some kind of conclusion as to what you might possibly do. And it'll be, I'm sure that the advances will be incremental, but we got to start. We got to keep doing it. We got to look at all these possibilities, the racial issues and non-racial issues and whatever there might be. We need data, and data is unfortunately lacking in the statistics on the national level. It's either not present or it's very delayed, but
Or
no
confusing.
time to sit on our hands. We need to work.
Yeah, one of the things about the data is that there's so much governmentese in the description of data. It's awful hard to tell what it means, but it's also not very timely in most cases.
Exactly.
But I think that the FBI has, and Ron, I think you mentioned it last time, there's been a 26% increase in violent crime, in murders, shootings. There's no hiding that fact. There's been a big increase in violent crime. I realize that there are a lot of people who want to blame the guns for that instead of the people who are pulling the trigger. But one of the components I think has to be considered is that in the middle of the pandemic last year, all across the country, states were releasing what they referred to as low-risk prisoners from state penitentiaries in order to try to curtail the spread of COVID-19. And that there were literally thousands of convicted felons that were released into the civilian population. And if our figures are right about mass incarceration of Blacks, then you'd have to assume that many of the people that were released were Black. They were part of the.
You have spoken a number of times about the 3 strikes and you're out crime control laws that were put in a number of years ago, and this is, in some ways, a positive response against that, because again, many of these felons were not violent, and particularly in terms of the low-level drug offenses, whether Black or Latino or whatever. So I'm not sure that there's a great correlation there, John. I agree that there's certainly a strong possibility that could have happened.
Mhm.
But does this explain it? I don't know. Again, statistics are lacking here.
Yes, I look at that. Uh, I don't know how many people were released. The reports refer to it as thousands. That could be 2,000 or 100,000. Don't know, but yes, these may have been nonviolent felons when they went into prison, but what were they when they came out? Um,
I've
and
only personally been acquainted with one incarcerated individual. Our church took a young man under wing a couple of years back, and he was in for drug offenses, and we helped him a little bit. He went through Oriana House for a bit, got out of that, was back in his own community. Within 6 months, he was back in jail for drug offenses. So, but he was nonviolent. He wouldn't have harmed anybody. I don't know.
How do you feel about the impact on young black? I mean, the most likely black criminal is a male under the age of 25. And I wonder about the message that they've been getting all of their life about where they fit into society, that they are subject to the soft bigotry of lowered expectations, according to President Bush.
You're defining systemic racism in some way here, John.
Yes.
That's true. It just, as you study it, it seems to be
Yes.
obvious.
If you're a young black male growing up, and you begin to hear about things like affirmative action, where blacks are not expected to compete with whites, other programs, diversity programs, we have to lower the bar in order to get blacks into jobs and universities and all. It just seems to me, if I were in that position, going back to when I was young, which was a long time ago.
Happy birthday, by the way, John.
Oh, thank you very much. It's fun to be 82. But the impact that would have when you're forming your opinion about where you fit into the world and comparing yourself to other people, it just seems to me that would have to have a devastating impact on the self-image of a young black.
Interesting question. I don't know if that's a straw man or not, John, setting up to be knocked down easily, but certainly we need better practice of equality here, as opposed to favoritism. You're talking really, I think, could be defined as favoritism in a way here, affirmative action and all that. I think some of these actions are very necessary. They may have unintended consequences, and what you're talking about could well be one of those. I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I think by and large is probably a good thing to promote these programs. And but at the same time, how does an individual develop self-worth? Again, community, family, community, what have you, all that sort of thing are very important to how you're brought up, how you and I were brought up to believe that we had a self-worth.
I look at affirmative action a little bit differently in that in many cases you're taking young men and women from Black communities that possibly didn't have the best education. If you look at the educational system in large urban centers, it's not as good in the Black communities as it is in the rich white suburbs. And by having affirmative action, you're giving those people there the chance. You're not saying you're not as good and you need a break. What you're saying is you didn't have the opportunities that those in other communities have. And then by placing those Blacks into a situation at at an Ivy League school or at a good college and seeing that they perform this as well is the way that you increase their self-esteem. And
I think
rather
that's
than
open. I think that's open to question whether they're performing well. Large majorities of them never graduate. In fact, never make it to their sophomore year.
Well, I could address athletics the same way. There's a lot of athletes that go to college simply because they can
Yeah.
shoot a basketball or run a football and then they never graduate. What was it, BYU, that was had a graduation rate for, I think it was BYU. Where was Tarkanian, the coach, years ago?
I don't
Back when I
remember.
got to graduate days, my college was had a high academic standard. They began to become a small college football power. Went out to the Pittsburgh and the Philadelphia area, where this is central Pennsylvania, and hired some relatively low academically talented individuals because they were great football players, but did give them the tutoring help to try to get them through college, and by and large, most of them did. So was that wrong? We nerds and academic types were a bit upset about it. College had a 25 game unbeaten streak, went to a postseason football game or a college of 1,000 students.
Maybe
But
we can tackle that a little bit later, but unfortunately, right now we are out of time.
You are watching WCTV, Wadsworth Community Television.